Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, a city under a perpetual moon, home of the Pontiff Sullivan, an area of Dark Souls 3 that is steeped in enigma and references to the world of Middle-earth. From the enemies we encounter to the environment, there's a ton of interesting ideas to explore. Hi, I'm Pebble with Boss Fog, and today I'm going to be going through how the world of J.R.R. Tolkien's Middle-earth inspired the subtle storytelling of From Software's Dark Souls 3 city of Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. Let's begin. Irithyll of the Boreal Valley is, for lack of a better word, a dead city. It's constantly patrolled by the Pontiff's Irithyllian knights, themselves a shade of their former selves, and kept under the close observation of his fire witches. The populace has been forced into slavery, the homes are abandoned, and the streets are unsafe to venture into. A constant moon also hangs over the city at all times, illuminating the city in an eerie glow. The city, silent and foreboding, bears striking similarities to a city in Tolkien's legendarium, that being Minas Morgul. Minas Morgul is the home of the Nazgul, or Ringwraiths, during the time The Lord of the Rings takes place, and is a place of terror and malice. Standing watch over the Morgul Vale, it guarded the only two entrances into Mordor, the Stairs of Cirith and the Morgul Pass, serving a crucial function to both the Númenóreans who initially manned it, and Sauron's forces, who later overtook it. This function of serving as a gateway to lands that should be guarded at all times is mirrored by how Irithyll functions in the world of Dark Souls. During the Ashen One's quest, they must travel through Irithyll of the Boreal Valley in order to access and defeat three Lords of Cinder, that being Yorm the Giant, Aldrich, Saint of the Deep, and the twin princes Lorien and Lothric. The city serves as both a base of operations for Pontiff Sullivan, who we will talk about later, and a hub connecting the areas where the Lords of Cinder reside. In the profaned capital, we see the Pontiff's influence everywhere. His jailers stalk the corridors of the Irithyll dungeons, keeping his abominations and prisoners in check, as well as deterring any warriors who would dare try to make their way through. If we delve further, we find his jailer handmaids worshipping the profane flame deep within the profaned capital, using the flames Sullivan coveted to great effect to burn any trespassers to ashes. Higher up in Lothric Castle, an area not directly accessible from Irithyll but still very much within the Pontiff's grasp, we find two of his Outrider knights, one in Lothric Castle and another in the Grand Archives. We also encounter two of his most devastating servants, the Dancer of the Boreal Valley and Vort of the Boreal Valley. These knights are mighty foes for the Ashen One, but we'll talk about them later in the video. But for now, let's turn to the role Aldrich plays in all of this. Aldrich is kind of a wild card when it comes to how he functions in all of this. There's quite a few theories floating around about how he and the Pontiff relate to one another. Some theories suggest that Aldrich, upon being awoken to Link the Fire, set his sights on his home of Irithyll and attacked the city with his deacons, swatting the Pontiff out of the way on his way to Anor Londo to devour the remaining gods, and await the coming of the Age of the Deep that he dreamt of. On the other hand, there's also the theory that Pontiff Sullivan allowed Aldrich to occupy Anor Londo and devour Gwyndolin, maybe to gain the favor of the Saint of the Deep, or keep him occupied in a secure location while he rules Irithyll with an iron fist. Whether Aldrich is there by the Pontiff's will, or if he forced his way in, I believe he functions in the same way that Shelob does in The Lord of the Rings. For those who may not be aware, Shelob is a demon in spider form in The Lord of the Rings, the spawn of a creature called Ungoliant, the personification of darkness and insatiable hunger in Tolkien's legendarium. Shelob guards the pass of Cirith Ungol, ensnaring and devouring anything unfortunate enough to be caught in her webs. Sauron calls her his pet, but, in reality, she is under the control of no one, her only companion being the hunger she constantly feels. In this way, I feel that Aldrich functions in the same way. This inhuman man-eater whose only goal is devouring his victims, with the Pontiff simply allowing him to dwell in Anor Londo, regardless of how he ended up there. Finally, to round off this first part of the video, I'd like to read off a section of the Two Towers which, to me at least, echoes how the glow of Irithyll matches the description of Minas Morgul from the Two Towers. Upon the further side, some way within the valley's arms, high on a rocky seat upon the black knees of the Fell Dueth, stood the walls and tower of Minas Morgul. All was dark about it, earth and sky, but it was lit with light. Not the imprisoned moonlight welling through the marble walls of Minas Irithyll long ago. Tower of the moon, fair and radiant in the hollow of the hills, paler indeed than the moon, ailing in some slow eclipse was the light of it now, wavering and blowing like a noisome exhalation of decay. A corpse light, a light that illuminated nothing. I don't know about you guys, but if that description was given to me, and you told me that it was about Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, I'd definitely believe you. It sounds like some Dark Souls fan fiction. Anyway, on to the next part. The name Irithyll of the Boreal Valley is also a not-so-subtle reference to the world of the Lord of the Rings. Earlier, we talked about how Minas Morgul was the home of the Ringwraiths, but before that, it was known as Minas Ithil, which means the Tower of the Moon in Sindarin. During its heyday, it was a thing of beauty, reflecting the light of the moon's radiance throughout Ithilien and the Morgul Vale, before falling to darkness. So, we can assume that the Ithil in the word Irithyll can translate to moon. But what does the ear mean? Well, that's slightly trickier. J.R.R. Tolkien was a philologist, which is someone who studies words and languages, and in his books he created many languages for the various species that occupied his world. I'm sure you guys can imagine that creating whole languages requires a bit of trial and error, and the term ear was no exception to this. To simplify it so it's not too tedious, ear means desirable or beautiful in primitive Elvish. He experimented with the roots of this term to coincide with the name Idril, juggling between it meaning desire, to want, glitter or sparkle, before settling on the aforementioned meaning. From this, we can assume that Irithyll means beautiful moon. Finally, what does boreal mean? That's quite a bit easier. Boreal means north or northern, which makes sense given the climate of Irithyll. So, to sum this up, Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, if transferred into Tolkien's world, would mean beautiful moon of the northern valley, which, given the view we're given when we first encounter it, makes perfect sense. For the final topic of this video, let's discuss the main boss of Irithyll, Pontiff Sulyvahn. Born in the painted world of Ariandel, Sulyvahn was a talented sorcerer with a special affinity for frost spells, a fitting endeavor given the frozen atmosphere of his homeland. He left the painted world eventually, as he hadn't experienced true loss or despair, and made his way into the outside world. On his travels, he came upon the profaned capital, discovering the profaned flame within. A burning desire would take root in his heart, and he would make his way to Irithyll of the Boreal Valley. Now, this is where the timeline of his activities gets a bit murky. I'm sure if you've played these games, you'll have realized that From Software leaves a lot of lore open to interpretation, and the Pontiff is no exception. So, for the sake of argument, I'm going to continue with my viewpoint on how he took over Irithyll. You may disagree, and that's okay. These games are meant to inspire differing viewpoints. So, when Sulyvahn encountered the profaned flame, I believe a certain darkness took root in his heart. Not a darkness born of evil, but a darkness born from humanity. Why do I think this? That's a video for another time, but to keep it short and on topic, I believe that the profaned flame is a union of the Chaos Flame of Izalith and Alsana, Silent Oracle, from Dark Souls 2. Alsana is a shard of Manus, Father of the Abyss, and she guards over the old chaos in Eliam Lois, a DLC area in Dark Souls 2. There's a few items that hint at this connection in Dark Souls 3, those being the Eleonora Axe, whose description says, "The profane flame was triggered by the curse of these women, relatives of a certain oracle, but despite their culpability, they went on living without any cares," as well as the profaned coal item, which says, "Remnants of the fire that burned down the profane capital, preserved in an icy skull." Furthermore, when we give this item to Andre the blacksmith, he says he senses the abyss in it. This combination of the words oracle, the abyss, and icy points to Eliam Lois in my eyes, as the word choice is too precise to ignore. The profane flame and its origins are a big enigma in Dark Souls 3, but for now, let's focus on how it affected Sullivan with its powers over the dark. As we know, darkness is connected to humanity in the Dark Souls universe, with it directly connected to the Age of Dark following the Age of Fire, the age that Gwyn, and everyone who has linked the fire after him, have desperately tried to put off. An Age of Dark would mean that the Age of the Gods is over, and this, I believe, is Sullivan's end goal. Through manipulation and cunning, he took over Irithyll and Anor Londo, and imprisoned its ruler, Gwyndolin, in the Cathedral of Anor Londo, and confined Gwyndolin's sister Yorshka at the top of a church tower. Another interesting piece of evidence that supports this idea of infiltration under the guise of friendship is this statue we find in Lothric Castle. It appears to be holding the profaned greatsword, a weapon wielded by Pontiff Sullivan. If this is Sullivan, we can assume that he somehow held a high station within the Lothric dynasty, a land known for linking the First Flame in ages past. Given that Prince Lothric eventually rejected his duty to link the First Flame and, given Sullivan fed Gwyndolin, the last god of Anor Londo, to Aldrich, we can assume that the Pontiff's end goal is for the fire to fade and usher in an Age of Dark, or, given his supposed allegiance to Aldrich, an Age of the Deep Sea. It would make sense that he would infiltrate two of the kingdoms known for supporting the linking of the fire and either corrupt them or destroy them completely to achieve his goals. But I'm rambling. Let's move on. Now, you might think that, given the many similarities between Minas Morgul and Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, that Sullivan would bear similarities to the Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Ringwraiths, but he actually has a lot more in common with the Dark Lord Sauron. His infiltration of the Anor Londo royalty and corruption he caused is inspired by how Sauron brought the people of Numenor under his sway. In Sauron's case, he was willingly captured by the Númenórean king Ar-Pharazôn and brought back to Numenor. Sauron, using his cunning, wit, and silver tongue, ingratiated himself to the Númenórean king, becoming his most trusted advisor. Under the influence of Sauron, the Númenóreans descended into darkness, taking to worshipping the first Dark Lord, Morgoth, and offering sacrifices to him. This deceitful corruption of a once great land is uncanny when it comes to these two characters, but there's an even bigger similarity: their fondness for rings. It's no small secret that Sauron used, or tried to use, rings of power to enslave the peoples of Middle-earth in an attempt to bend them to his will. The 9 rings given to men particularly had egregious effects on their owners. Over time, these rings corrupted and ensnared their wearers, dissolving their free will and bringing them completely under Sauron's control. They also had an effect on their physical forms. The longer they wore the rings, the more their body would fade away over time, until they became completely invisible to mortal eyes. This physical corruption from Sauron's rings is mirrored in how Pontiff Sullivan's rings work. But first, let's have some backstory on them. Do you remember fighting this beast on the bridge leading to Irithyll? Or the two residing near the Aldrich's faithful covenant? Horrific, right? Truly a monstrous being. But there is more to these beasts than meets the eye. You see, they started out as knights in Pontiff Sullivan's service, but for whatever reason, they were deemed expendable, and so they were sent out into the far reaches of the land, guarding key passages the Ashen One would need to access to continue their quest. We find Boreal Outrider Knights in the Road of Sacrifices, the Lothric Castle Barracks, and the Grand Archives. But most importantly, we find the most elite versions of this enemy blocking access to the Undead Settlement and Upper Lothric Castle in the form of Vort of the Boreal Valley and the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. Being boss variants of this enemy, they block crucial locations that the Ashen One needs to access to continue their journey, with Vort's soul giving us access to a very interesting ring called the Pontiff's Left Eye. The description of this item reads, "Knights who peer into the black orb are lured into battles of death, transformed into frenzied beasts." We find the Pontiff's right eye upon being dropped by the beast guarding the bridge leading to Irithyll that we mentioned earlier, with its description saying the exact same thing that the right eye says. As you may have guessed, this is confirmation that both Vort and the Dancer will eventually degrade into these crocodilian beasts over time, losing every aspect of their free will and humanity, and completely serving the Pontiff and his goals. It should also be mentioned that being given these rings are described as being the equivalent to exile, almost as if the Pontiff didn't want such violent and uncontrollable knights close to his home, which is an interesting departure from how the 9 Rings of Men functioned in The Lord of the Rings, with Sauron entrusting his most important tasks to the Nazgul. But, in my headcanon, I see the Nazgul and the Outrider Knights as serving the same purpose to their respective masters. While Sauron gives commands to his ringwraiths, I believe that the Pontiff dispatches his knights to a distinctive location and utilizes their bestial nature and ferocity to his advantage to keep people away, almost like a rabid dog. Would you want to access an area with a crazed animal guarding it? I know I wouldn't. But nevertheless, there's a very close relationship between how Sauron's and Pontiff Sulivan's rings work, corrupting their wearers and bending them to their will. They're both master manipulators, and those under them suffered a fate worse than death. And that's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you happen to have anything to add to or discredit my theories, feel free to comment them down below. This is my first in-depth lore video on the world of Dark Souls, so maybe I was clutching at straws or rambling like a hollow, but either way, I'd love to hear about them. I've always been interested in Pontiff Sulivan as a character, and given that he was initially meant to be the final boss of Dark Souls 3, there's a ton of lore surrounding him, and definitely some things that I've missed in this video. Also, be sure to stay tuned for my next video where I'll be attempting to beat Dark Souls 3 using only the Soul Arrow. I've done a few challenge runs of DS3 before, but this will be the first one I've put on video, so hopefully it isn't too hard. Oh, please don't be too hard. But anyway, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Take care of yourselves.